The rain started as a nuisance and turned into something else entirely somewhere around the county line. Daniel Whitfield gripped the wheel a little tighter, leaning forward the way a man does when the wipers can't quite keep up. He'd only gone out for a length of PVC pipe, the kind of errand that fills a Tuesday evening when you're 63 and retired, and the leaky spigot out back has been on your list for 2 weeks too long. Carol had told him to wait until morning. He hadn't listened. Now the sky was doing its best to make her point for her. He almost missed the hazards. Just past the bend where Route 9 narrowed to 2 lanes, a pair of taillights blinked weakly through the sheeting rain. A small sedan, pulled half onto the shoulder, hood dark. No driver visible through the fogged rear window. Daniel slowed without quite deciding to. Some habits outlive the reasons for them. His father had never passed a stranded car in 40 years of driving, storm or no storm, and Daniel supposed that had become his own rule too, inherited the way rules like that always are. He pulled up behind her, hazards joining hers, and sat a moment with the engine running. Somebody's kid, probably. Cell phone's dead. 20 minutes, tops. He grabbed the flashlight from the glove box and stepped out into weather that had no business being this bad in April. The woman was already out of her car by the time he reached it, hunched under a jacket held over her head, more useless gesture than shelter. "It just died," she called over the rain. "No warning, no nothing." "Pop the hood for me," Daniel said, already moving toward the front of the car. "Let's have a look." She did, and he lifted it. Flashlight beam swinging over a battery, a belt. Nothing obviously wrong in the 2 seconds a dying flashlight and a downpour allowed him to look. He'd need better light. He'd need a tow, more likely. "Might be your alternator," he said, straightening up, wiping rain from his eyes with the back of his wrist. "I can't tell much out here. You got someone I can call for you? Or, I've got a phone in the truck, if yours is dead." "It's dead," she said. "Everything's dead tonight." There was something in the way she said it. Dry, almost amused, like she'd made peace with the evening being a disaster before he'd ever pulled up. That made him glance over at her properly for the first time. She'd turned, angling herself against the wind, and the truck's headlights caught her full in the face. Daniel's stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the cold rain running down his collar. He knew that face. He knew it the way you know a song from one note, before your mind has even caught up with the knowing. Some older, faster part of him recognizing the tilt of her chin, the particular shape her mouth made when she was trying not to look as rattled as she felt. 40 years had changed the rest of it. Silver threading through what used to be dark hair, lines at the eyes that hadn't been there, but the face underneath all of it hadn't gone anywhere. It had just been waiting. "It can't be. You all right?" she asked, because he'd gone quiet, and quiet men staring in the rain probably weren't the reassuring kind. "Fine," Daniel managed. "Just thinking about the alternator." He was not thinking about the alternator. He was thinking about a summer that ended 38 years ago without warning, the same way, apparently, her car had tonight. He was thinking about a name he hadn't let himself say out loud in decades, sitting right there behind his teeth, refusing to come out until he was sure. Because if he said it, and he was wrong, he'd feel like a fool. And if he said it, and he was right, he didn't let himself finish that thought. "Let's get you out of this rain," he said instead, nodding toward his truck. "I'll get you somewhere warm. Get this sorted." She hesitated only a second, the ordinary hesitation of a stranger deciding whether to trust a stranger, then nodded and followed him toward the truck, both of them soaked through, the storm showing no sign of relenting. It wasn't until she climbed into the passenger seat, wringing water from her sleeve, and looked over at him under the dome light that she went still too. Her eyes moved over his face the way his had moved over hers. Something shifted behind them, recognition arriving late, the way it does when you've spent decades convincing yourself a person only exists in memory. Neither of them said the name. Not yet. But the silence in that truck cab, rain hammering the roof, was suddenly louder than the storm outside. And Daniel understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that whatever this evening had been about to be, it wasn't about a broken-down car anymore. Neither of them spoke until the truck was moving, wipers slapping, the stranded sedan shrinking in the side mirror. "You're not going to say it," she said finally, eyes forward, voice careful. "So I will. Daniel?" Something in his chest loosened and tightened at once, hearing his name in a voice he hadn't heard in nearly 4 decades. "Renee." He said it quiet, like testing whether the word would hold. "I wasn't sure. I didn't want to be the fool who guessed wrong." "You weren't wrong." He glanced at her once, quick, then back to the road, because looking too long felt like standing too close to a ledge. "What in the world are you doing on Route 9 in a storm?" "Visiting my sister over in Millbrook. Was heading back to the highway when the car just—" She lifted a hand, let it drop. Gave up, like it had been waiting for the worst possible moment. "Cars have a sense of timing," Daniel said. "Rotten one, usually." That got a small laugh out of her, and for a second it was almost easy. 2 old friends caught in bad weather, nothing more complicated than that. He held on to the feeling as long as it lasted, which wasn't long. By the time he tried the only motel out that way, the woman on the phone told him what he already suspected. A water main break on the interstate had every room booked solid for 40 miles. He sat with the phone still in his hand, thinking. "I could try further out," he said. "But it's a bad night to be driving around looking." Renee was quiet, watching the rain streak sideways past the window. "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not trouble. You're just—" He stopped himself before he said someone I used to know. "Better than I knew myself," and finished instead with, "Stuck. Same as anybody." He called Carol from the truck, the wipers still going, and told her everything plainly. The car, the storm, the stranger who wasn't really a stranger. He half expected some hesitation in his wife's voice when he said the name Renee, some old instinct in her picking up on something he couldn't name himself. But Carol only sighed, practical as ever. "Well, you can't leave the poor woman on the side of the road. Bring her here. We'll put her in the guest room. I'll get sheets on the bed." "You sure?" "Daniel. It's a Tuesday night in a hailstorm, I'm sure." He hung up feeling something he couldn't quite place. Relief. And underneath the relief, a strange, small disappointment that there'd been no resistance at all. The guest room got its sheets. The kettle got put on. And somewhere between the second cup of coffee and the third, Carol excused herself with a headache that might have been real and might have been a kindness, leaving Daniel and Renee at the kitchen table with the storm still working outside the window. "So," Renee said, wrapping both hands around her mug. 38 years. 38 years, he agreed. "I looked for you, you know. After." She said it lightly, like it cost her nothing, though the way her eyes stayed fixed on the mug told him otherwise. "Before everything had your name in it forever, back when a person could just disappear." "I wrote you a letter," Daniel said. He hadn't meant to say it so plainly, but it came out anyway. 38 years of not saying it finally giving way. "After your dad moved you all out to Ohio, I wrote it that same week, never heard back." Renee's head came up slowly. "I never got a letter." "I know that now." He turned his own mug in a slow circle on the table, not looking at her. "Found out years later my mother had strong opinions about who I ought to be writing to at 19. I didn't know she'd been going through my things until it was far too late to matter. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain. "So that's it," Renee said softly. "That's the whole reason. A mother who didn't approve, and a letter that never made it out of the house." "That's the whole reason," Daniel said. "Feels almost too small, doesn't it? For something that changed as much as it did." "It usually is too small," she said. "That's the cruel part. You imagine some enormous reason, some catastrophe, and it's just a letter in a drawer." He looked up at her then, really looked, and something in his chest ached in a way he hadn't let it ache in a long, long time. "I thought about you," he admitted. "More than I ever told anybody. More than I probably should have. Married as long as I've been." Renee held his gaze a beat too long before answering. "I thought about you too, Daniel. More than was good for me." The rain kept coming down outside, relentless, and neither of them moved to end the conversation there, even though some quieter, wiser part of Daniel knew that they probably should have. The house had gone still by the time they finally rose from the table. Carol long asleep down the hall, the storm outside softened now to a steady patter instead of its earlier fury. Daniel walked Renee toward the guest room with a flashlight he didn't need, just for something to hold on to. "Thank you," she said, stopping at the door. "For tonight. For not just leaving me on the side of the road with a dead car and a grudge against the universe." "Wasn't going to happen," Daniel said. "Whatever else changed, I hope I didn't change that much." "You haven't." She studied him a moment in the hallway light, something soft and unguarded crossing her face. "You really haven't, Daniel." He should have said goodnight then. He knew it even as the moment stretched past the place where goodnight belonged. "It's strange," Renee said instead, quieter now. "Standing here with you, like no time passed at all, and also like an entire lifetime did." "Both things can be true," Daniel said. "I've found that's usually how it goes." She reached out, not quite meaning to, it seemed, the way her hand paused halfway before finishing the motion, and touched his forearm, just briefly, just to steady herself against the doorframe. Except her hand stayed a beat longer than balance required, and Daniel felt the warmth of it straight through his shirt sleeve, into places that had gone quiet a long time ago. Neither of them moved. "For old time's sake," Renee said, and there was a smile in it. But underneath the smile, something else. Something that wasn't joking at all. "You could just stay a while longer. Share the bed like we used to pretend we would, back when we thought we had all the time in the world." The words landed and didn't leave. "Say goodnight. Say goodnight right now, Daniel." But his feet didn't move, and neither did hers, and the space between them, which had been a perfectly reasonable, respectable space a moment ago, had somehow closed to almost nothing. "Renee," he started, and didn't know how the sentence was supposed to end. "I know," she said softly. "I know exactly what I'm saying. I'm not asking you to pretend I don't." Her eyes held his, and for one long, suspended moment the hallway, the house, the 35 years of his marriage down the hall all seemed to fall away into something very far off and very small. He could hear his own heartbeat. He could hear her breath catch, just slightly, in the quiet. Then she leaned in, or he did. After, he could never fully say which. And for a handful of seconds there was nothing but the brief, warm press of her mouth against his, unhurried, full of everything neither of them had said in 38 years. And then it was over, and the hallway was just a hallway again, and Daniel was standing in it with his heart going like a hammer, and his wife asleep 40 feet away. He stepped back first. "I can't," he said, voice rough. "Renee, I can't. That wasn't—" "I know," she said again, and this time it sounded like an apology. Her hand had gone to her own mouth, like she was as startled by it as he was. "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me." "It's not just you," Daniel said, because it wasn't, because pretending otherwise would be its own kind of lie. "I let it happen too." They stood there a moment longer, both of them shaken, both of them very carefully not looking at each other. "Good night, Daniel," Renee finally said, and slipped into the guest room, the door clicking shut behind her with a softness that felt louder than any slam could have. Daniel stood alone in the hallway for a long time after, staring at nothing, his pulse still not settled. He'd almost had 38 years back in the space of one held breath. And the worst part, the part he couldn't look at directly, the part that followed him all the way down the hall to the bed where his wife lay sleeping, wasn't the kiss itself. It was how badly some part of him hadn't wanted it to stop. Daniel didn't sleep. He lay beside Carol in the dark, listening to her breathing, steady and unaware, and felt like a stranger in his own bed. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in that hallway. The warmth of Renee's hand on his arm, the half-second before the space between them disappeared. He turned it over and over, looking for the moment he should have stepped back sooner, and couldn't find it. Because the truth, the thing he couldn't say, even to himself in the dark, was that he hadn't wanted to find it. By the time gray light started at the edges of the curtains, he gave up on sleep entirely and went down to the kitchen. Renee was already there. She'd made coffee, found the machine on her own, which struck him as such a small, ordinary thing to do after a night like the one they'd had, and she was sitting at the table with her bag packed at her feet, dressed, ready. "Tow truck's coming for the car at 8, she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I called first thing. Didn't want this to be awkward longer than it needed to be." "Renee, you don't have to say anything, Daniel." She wrapped both hands around her mug the way she had the night before, though nothing about this morning felt like the night before. "I crossed a line I had no business crossing. You're a married man. I knew that when I said it, and I said it anyway. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't know how wrong that was." "We both crossed it," he said. "I didn't stop it as fast as I should have." She looked up at him then, and there was something almost grateful in her expression, that he hadn't let her carry the whole weight of it alone. He sat down across from her, the coffee going cold between his hands, and for a while neither of them said anything. "I loved you once," Daniel said finally. "Really loved you. The kind that doesn't fully go away, I don't think, no matter how many years pass or how much life gets built on top of it. Last night proved that much, if nothing else." "I know," Renee said quietly. "I felt the same. I think that's exactly why it scared me so much when it happened." "But loving you once," Daniel went on, choosing the words slowly, like he was building something that needed to hold weight, "isn't the same as this being where I belong. Carol isn't the woman I settled for after you left. She's the woman I chose. Every single day for 35 years, I've had 100 small chances to walk away from that, and I never took one of them. Not once, not until last night nearly happened without me even deciding it." Renee nodded slowly, eyes bright, though she blinked whatever was gathering there back before it could fall. "That's not nothing, Daniel. 35 years of choosing someone, every day, that's not nothing at all. I'm glad it's true, even if part of me wishes it wasn't. I'm not sorry I know you're alive and well, and still yourself," he said. "I'm not sorry for last night in the way you might expect, but I am sorry for how close I let it get. That part I'll carry." Outside, a truck engine rumbled up the driveway. The tow, right on time. Renee stood, gathering her bag, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Two people who had once imagined an entire life together and had ended up, instead, with one strange, rain-soaked night, decades later, to close the door properly on something that had never really been closed at all. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," she said at the door. "You too, Renee." She didn't ask him not to tell Carol. He didn't offer either way. Some things, he was beginning to understand, didn't need to be spoken to be settled. He watched from the porch as the tow truck pulled her car away, and her rental idled at the curb a moment longer before pulling out. Taillights shrinking down the wet road, the same way they'd first appeared to him less than 24 hours before. Then the driveway was empty, and the morning was quiet, and Daniel stood there a long while, unsure whether what he felt was relief or grief, or some tangled version of both that he'd be sorting out for a long time yet. 3 days passed before the strangeness of it began to settle into something Daniel could carry without his hands shaking. He didn't tell Carol. He turned the decision over more than once in the shower, on his walks, lying awake at odd hours, and each time he arrived at the same place. Not because he was protecting himself, because some things, he'd come to believe, belonged to the person who survived them, not to the person who never needed to know they'd been in danger at all. Carol had slept soundly through the only night in 35 years his marriage had ever truly wavered, and he found he wanted to let her keep that particular peace, even if it meant carrying the rest of it alone. It was a Thursday evening, unremarkable in every way, when it finally landed properly. Carol was in the living room folding laundry, humming something tuneless and half-remembered, the kind of sound she made without noticing she was making it. Daniel stood in the doorway a moment, watching her fold one of his shirts, with the particular efficiency of a woman who'd folded 10,000 shirts before it, and would fold 10,000 more, and felt something shift quietly into place in his chest. It wasn't dramatic. There was no swelling music to it, no sudden clarity like a light switched on. It was smaller than that, and somehow larger for being small. Just Carol, humming, folding laundry on a Thursday, entirely unaware that 4 nights earlier her husband had stood in a hallway and nearly given away everything she didn't even know was at risk. This, he thought, this ordinary, unremarkable thing. This is what I almost traded for one warm hallway and 38 years of wondering. He almost told her, right then. The words came right up to the edge of him. "Carol, something happened. I need you to know." And he let them sit there a moment, testing their weight, before deciding, gently and finally, to set them back down. Not every truth needed saying to be honored. Sometimes, the truest thing a man could do with a mistake he hadn't quite made was simply become the kind of husband who'd never come that close again. "You're staring," Carol said, not looking up from the laundry, a smile in her voice. "Just thinking how lucky I am," Daniel said, and meant it more than she could have known. "Well, don't let it go to your head." But she looked up then, and something in his face must have caught her, because her smile softened into something quieter, more searching. "You've been somewhere else these last few days. You all right?" "I'm all right," he said. "Better than all right, actually. I think I just needed reminding of a few things." She didn't press. 35 years had taught her when a man needed to arrive at something on his own time, and she let him. That evening, they sat out on the porch as the light went gold and then gray, the way they had 1,000 evenings before, saying very little, needing very little, said. Carol's hand found his on the arm of the chair, the way it always did, without either of them deciding it should. Daniel looked out at the yard, at the ordinary dusk settling over an ordinary life, and understood. Fully, finally, in a way the last 38 years apparently hadn't managed to teach him until one stranded car on a rainy road forced the lesson. That this was never the smaller life. It had only ever looked that way from the outside, to a younger man who didn't yet know what quiet devotion, kept faithfully across decades, was actually worth. He'd almost learned that the hard way. He was grateful, more than he could say, that he hadn't had to.